Erev Tov, thank you so much for the slight change for tonight. Hopefully we'll be okay. I want to go back for a moment to Daf Ayin Beis Amid Beis, if you have it. And look again, because I think I have a new insight perhaps, to the Gemara of Esfei Rav Chizda, and I'll tell you exactly where it is in a second.
What daf, Rabbi Berzon?
I'm going back just for a few minutes to Daf Ayin Beis Amid Beis. And you'll see Esfei Rav Chizda, let's see where we can count approximately 12 lines up from the bottom. And this is after Rav Huna made the statement that a katan is a rodef, and you can kill him to save the nirdaf. Esfei Rav Chizda l'Rav Huna. Yotza Rosho ein nogin bo lefish ein dochin nefesh mipnei nefesh. So this is a brayso, of course, a Mishnah in Masechet Olos, and the Mishnah has a reisha and a sefer. The Gemara jumps to the reisha. We'll go back. The Gemara jumps to the sefer. We'll go back to the reisha. And you'll see the reisha quoted by Rashi, Dibra Maskil Yotza Rosha, which is in the wide lines in Rashi, it's about 7 lines down. So Rashi tells you that we're talking about Isha Makasha Lele, Umisukenes. So she's in danger during the birth, and the embryo's birth process is endangering the mother. Ketani Reisha, the Reisha of the Mishnah in Olos says, Hachaya poshetis yoda v'chod chaso umotziaso levarim. In the Reisha, the baby has not yet emerged at all. The head is not out, and therefore we will destroy the life of the ubar in order to preserve the life of the mother. And so far, that's not a kasha on Rav Huna in the case of a katan, because we see that the ubar, like the katan, is a rodef. And Rashi now introduces a whole new concept we've spoken about in the past. I want to look at it again. In order to justify the fact that we kill the ubar to save the mother. And we're going to see here in front of our eyes in Mirz Hashem machlokes between the Rashi and the Rambam. Why do we kill the ubar to save the mother? Rashi says the kol zman shelo yotzo li'avir olam. As long as the embryo has not emerged, lav nefeshu. The ubar does not have the status of a nefesh. V'nitan lo hargo lahatzil es imo. However, says Rashi, and this is the sefer that's quoted here in our Gemara, aval yotza roshe nogivo lahargo tahavi lekiyalud v'ein dochin nefesh mitnei nefesh. We'll stop here in Rashi. So Rashi is making the following distinction. Why do we kill the ubar before it pops its head out? In order to save the mother, and yet after its head is out, we will not kill the ubar, and as a result, the mother apparently is going to perish. So, Maishno, what's the difference between the Reisha, where Lo Yatza Rosho, and the Sefer Yatza Rosho? The Rambam is going to come up with a whole nother thesis, but Rashi says it all depends on the status of the ubar. Does the ubar have the status of a nefesh? Is it born yet or not? And Rashi says that before it emerges, then it's not a nefesh. And if it's not a nefesh, then clearly we're allowed to take its life for the sake of saving a nefesh. But once it emerges, Yotza Rosho, it's a nefesh, and ein dochin nefesh b'nei nefesh. You can't choose one nefesh over the other. And in Mirz Hashem later on, we'll see another application of this rule of ein dochin nefesh b'nei nefesh In the case of someone, and the Ana says to him, kill so-and-so, or I'll kill you. And you're not allowed to kill him because my chazes. We can't choose one nefesh over the other. However, before the baby pops its head, Rashi says it's not a nefesh. If it's not a nefesh, then there's no Isur Tzitcha. And clearly, we're going to destroy the ubar to save the mother. Now, Rashi, it seems to me, at least, and I hope you'll agree with me, is really plunging into a major controversy in halacha. And this is a sugya at the end of Yoma, dealing with the case of a mother who's pregnant and she smells something on Yom Kippur, and we determine that she has to eat. However, it's not clear in the Gemara why will we allow her to eat. And here we have a major machlokas rishonim. According to one school of thought, we'll allow her to violate Yom Kippur, and a similar halach applies to Shabbos, in order to save the mother's life. If the mother's life was not in danger, and it's only the life of the ubar that's in danger, we would not allow overriding neither Yom Kippur and certainly not Shabbos for the sake of the life of the ubar. And the other school of Rishonim argues that even for the sake of the ubar alone, we will permit being doche Yom Kippurim and even Shabbos, just for the sake of the ubar. And it would seem that the machlokas here revolves around the following issue. What is the status of an ubar? Is it a nefesh? And we have Allah and pikuach nefesh v'chai bohem, and that overrides all isurei Torah. Or is it not a nefesh? And if it's not a nefesh, we can't violate Yom Kippur for the sake of saving the nefesh. We could only violate Yom Kippur for the sake of saving the mother. Rashi here in Masechet Sanhedrin Ayin Beis Amid Beis is taking a stand on this issue. And he is interpreting the difference between the ratio of lo yotza rosho and the seif of yotza rosho in terms of that machlokas rishonim. Meaning, Rashi takes the way of those rishonim that we will violate the Shabbos and Yom Kippur for the sake of whom? Of the mother, not for the sake of the ubar. And the reason for that is, says Rashi, he supplies it very clearly here, lav nefesh. And if the ubar is not a nefesh, we cannot override the Shabbos for the sake of saving the ubar. However, Rashi's explanation will not suffice according to those Rishonim who define an ubar as a nefesh and apply the principle of a chai bohem, of pikuach nefesh, even to the case of an ubar. So the good news is that Rashi has al mi lismoch in that sense. The bad news is that Rashi would contradict one sheet in the Rishonim, and then we would be hard-pressed to understand the difference between the Reish and the Sefer. Now let's go back to the Gemara and read the Gemara's answer to this question. V'amai, the Gemara asks Rodefu, why are you telling me that after the baby emerges, we can no longer take the life of the ubar for the sake of saving the mother? What about the halach of a rodef? And before we see the Gemara's answer, let's add another point over here. And that is that if we're going with rodef, then there doesn't seem to be any difference logically between lo yotza rosho and yotza rosho. In both cases, the baby's body, as it is being projected through the birth canal, is endangering the life of the mother. So in effect, the Gemara seems to be asking a kind of a bishlema question. Bishlema, I understand the Reisha, lo yatsa rosho. We can take the life of the baby because the baby's a rodef. But the Seifa, where we should apply the same din of a rodef, the baby doesn't lose its status as a rodef after it pops its head out, and the mother's life is still being endangered by the birth of the baby as it projects itself through the birth canal. The Gemara says, Amai, why are you applying the principle of ein doche nefesh nefesh? Even after the baby is born, it is a rodef. And be'etzem, in truth, it began its status as a rodef even before it was born and continues to be a rodef even after it's born. So we can never apply the principle of ein doche nefesh b'nei nefesh in a case of a rodef. What we said before, my chazis, we don't have the ability to choose the life of one over the life of the other. We don't know which life is worth more in the eyes of the Almighty. That's true until we get to the parasha of Rodef. Once we're in the category of a Rodef, clearly we will kill the life of the Rodef for the sake of Hatzalas HaNirda. And that's what should happen here, argues Rav Chizda, in the Seifa of Yatsa Rosha. So Gemara's logic seems to be crystal clear, but the Gemara is not making any distinction between Lav Nefesh and Nefesh. In fact, the Gemara's answer will bear me out. Shiny Hassam, why don't we kill the baby to save its mother after it pops its head out? To be Shamayim Karad File. Now those words, Mishamayim Karad File, seem to indicate that the Gemara is addressing head-on this issue of Rodef. And this, to me, is very bad news for Rashi, because what are you telling me? It's not a Rodef. That's not relevant to our discussion. We're not talking about a distinction between the Reisha, Lo Yatsa Rosha, and Ratza Rosha, and the Sefer because it was a Rodef, not a, forget about Rodef. According to Rashi, there's no need to introduce the question of Rodef and to vacillate back and forth as to whether or not the Uvar has the status of Rodef. Forget about all that. I'll grant you that the Uvar is a Rodef. And according to Rav Huna, the Ubar is a Rodef. And that could be fine according to Rashi. But nevertheless, even though it's a Rodef, but we have a principle of Ein Doch Nefesh B'nei Nefesh, and we have to now assume that in the ratio we'll take the life of the Uber because it's not a Nefesh. And according to Rashi, the issue of taking the life of the Uber hinges on whether or not it's a Nefesh. And yet the Gemara seems to clearly apply the question of Rodef. Does the Uber have the status of a Rodef? That seems to be the main question that the Gemara is focused on. The good news is that the Rambam is going to learn, I'm going to try to prove to you, that this sugya revolves around the issue of Rodef. And where's the Rambam? Perek Aleph Milchas Rotzech Halacha Tes. Now, the Rambam introduces this whole question of, should we take the life of the Uber, should we not? By putting a framework which is called a lav of lo yachus. And the Rambam derives from lo yachus al nefesh harodef the principle that there's a losas in the Torah if we might be if a nefesh, if I can use that term, has political implications these days, and we would be inhibited before we would kill the rodef. And if we do so, then we violate a law. Lefichach, says the Rambam, since we are not allowed to have compassion on the rodef and stand by idly while the nirdaf is killed. Now, I don't know if David and Ari are with me. That's always the drawback of, oh, he's still there. I don't know if David's there. At least he turned it on. That's where he is. We don't know. And the Rambam says, Lefichach horu chachamim sha ubra. Ubra means the mother who's in the process of birth. Mekashel leilin mutar lachtoch ha'ubar b'mei'eha. And the Rambam, which I think he's using his knowledge of medicine, goes into great gory detail about how we kill the ubar. I'm not even going to read that part of the Rambam. It's not good for my... Anyway. And he says, Mipnei shehu kirodef achreha laharga. Clearly, the Rambam is rejecting Rashi. The reason we take the life of the ubar has nothing to do with lav nefeshu. And indeed, I'm going to show from a number of different Rambams that the ubar has the status of a nefesh, according to the Rambam. The Rambam is going to tell me that if a ben Noach kills an ubar, oh, David, you are here. Good. Then we take the life and we condemn call it a physician or whoever he is, to death because he took the life of an ubar. In fact, the Rambam is going to tell us that in a case of a Jew who took the life of a nefel, he's basically chayav misa, but ain't bezdim misa also. And if a nefel has the status of a nefesh, and therefore the shvichas domim, how much more so the case of an ubar, who, as far as we know, is perfectly healthy. So the Rambam therefore has to come up with an alternative approach, but I think his approach is written right there in the Gemara, when the Gemara says, "V'amai rodefu," that the ubar is a rodef. And the Rambam says, therefore, is mutar, we're allowed to kill the ubar. The imisha hotzi rosho, if the ubar has already begun its birth process, ain no gimbo, says the Rambam. Can't touch the ubar. We know full well the mother's going to die. Shein dochin nefesh mitnei nefesh. And listen carefully, the Rambam adds 4 words. Vizeu tivo shel olam. This is nature. Now, I'd like to raise 3 questions on the Rambam. Question number 1. If the Rambam holds that the ubar is a rodev, and his counter argument is deu tivo shel olam, which is the Rambam's translation of mishamaya karadfile, so then I begin to wonder, why does the ubar lose its status as a rodev when it pops its head out? As we indicated earlier, and I think this is clearly, this is very compelling argument. There's no difference between lo yotza rosho and yotza rosho as far as the ubar is concerned. It's a rodef this way, it's a rodef that way. So if the Rambam took the highway that although the ubar is a nefesh, we will take its nefesh because it's a rodef, then we have trouble with zeu tivo shel olam, which is ostensibly to be mafkia the shem rodef, and that applies only after the baby pops its head out. Why should that be so? So question number 1, let me just reiterate the question. Why, according to the Rambam, given the fact that the Rambam classifies the ubar as a rodev, why then does the ubar lose its status as a rodev after it's born, and the Rambam calls it zeu tivo shel olam? If it's a rodef, then it's a rodef even after it pops its head. And if it's not a rodef, and the Rambam holds that the uber is in fact a nefesh, then how can you take the life of the uber before it is born? Ein dochin nefesh mei nefesh. Question number 2. Why does the Rambam say that Harei ze kirodef? Excuse me. The Rambam adds a chaf hadimyon kirodef, implying that the ubar is not really a rodef. It is a rodef, but it's not a rodef. What does that mean? And finally, I don't understand why the Rambam, in formulating this halacha, injects this into the framework of the lav of lo yachus. In general, there's a lav not to stand by and hesitate from killing the rodef. But dafka here at this juncture, the Rambam with the word lefichach tells us that we're going to kill the uber to save the mother before it's born, and it comes under lo yachus. After all, lo yachus, according to the Rambam, applies in every single case of rodef. But yet, when the Rambam got to this case of ubra makasha leiled, and we're going to kill the uber to save the mother, the Rambam chooses that halacha to be placed in the perspective of lo yachus. Why does he do so? Now, as a true blue brisker, we have to introduce some sort of tzvei dinim over here. Because if the Rambam uses the chaf hadimyon, kirodev, then obviously there are different levels of a rodev. There's like a full-fledged rodev and a half-baked rodev. And that leads us to the following question. Would it be fair to assume that the basic premise or the underlying factor of a rodev, of defining someone as a rodev, is a ma'aser redifa? We need a ma'aser redifa. It's the ma'aser redifa that sets up the shem rodev. Without a ma'aser redifa, you're not a rodev. In the katan case of Rav Huna, there is a ma'aser redifa. I mean, you could talk about the fact that a katan is not responsible for his actions. You could talk about the fact that a katan is a not lavar das. And you could talk about the fact that a katan is a lavar onshin. There are many things you could say about a katan. And Rav Huna is oblivious to all of that. All he needs is a ma'aser redifa, but he has a ma'aser redifa. And therefore, Rav Huna is willing to classify a katan as a rodef. But the case of ubar is radically different. There is no ma'aser redifa. And this could shed a new light on the language of our Gemara, Mishamaya Karadfile. In essence, the ubar is like, shall I say, an inanimate object that's being thrust by Shamayim, by nature, in a way that it endangers the life of the mother. But we cannot attribute that action of emerging from the birth canal as a ma'aser redifa, because there is no ma'aser. The ubar is totally passive. Like if you had a river that was flowing down and you had a plank of wood on the river, that plank of wood coming down at a speed being thrust by the stream of water could be a very dangerous element, but you wouldn't call that a Meiser Redifa. So we would like to use the terminology Shev V'Altase. Is there such a thing as a passive Meiser Redifa? It's not really an active Meiser Redifa. It's a Redifa b'mitzius without a Meiser. And here's where we quote the Rambam, if you recall, in Perek Ches Milchus Chovel of Mazik, with the case of the Masa. So you have a ship, and the weight of the merchandise is going to bring the ship down. And we can predict that all the members of the ship will perish. Somebody goes ahead, and like the case of Yonah, they throw overboard that weight, that very heavy merchandise, and the Rambam writes, Potter, the mashlith is Potter. Shamasa kimo rodef, again the chaf adimyon, it's like a rodef. Umitzvah rabba asa shehishlich. The Rambam gives him brownie points for throwing the weight overboard. And the Rambam says, you're killing this merchandise. Mitzvah Ram. Why? Because kir rodef. It's like a rodef. Again, the Rambam is hesitant to go all the way and call it a rodef. It's not a full-fledged rodef, but it's kir rodef. Now, what's the difference between the masa, the weight of which is endangering the entire crew and all those aboard the ship as well, and a regular rodef? Why does the Rambam say, well, it's kir rodef, but not a real rodef? And perhaps we have an answer to that question. When is it a kir rodef situation, and when is it a rodef situation? Can anybody help me out here? That's the problem with Zoom, you know. You know how to unmute yourself, right? I could probably do that for you somehow, but you can do it yourself. Who can help me out over here? When does the Rambam say kir rodef? We have two cases. What's the common link between these two cases, the masa and the case of the uber? Anybody help me out here, please?
They're both honest.
Okay, that's good. But what is the difference between this onus and the real case of rodef? Do you remember that yeah?
Maybe it's kavana.
Okay, there's no kavana, it's onus.
Both the baby and the mastad don't have, they're not intending to kill anyone. Whereas with the
Excellent.
Normal rodef, they're out to kill you.
Excellent. 100%. I can't question neither onus nor the lack of kavana. That's both correct, but I'm not sure if the katan case, which is a case of a full-fledged rodef, and that's what Rav Huna was pointing out, is considered kavana. I don't know. I mean, I don't know if a katan is capable of kavana. But let's go back to the drawing board. Do you remember that we spoke about the basic requirement, the basic definition of a rodef? What is the sine qua non, if you will? What is the precondition to create a rodef? What makes a rodef a rodef? You know, something like Shakespeare would say. What's in a rodef? Anybody? A Meiser Redifa. Are you able to to internalize that? Again, it means kavana, and it means there was no onus, whatever it means. But at the end of the day, a rodef means redifa. And redifa is active. The Rambam is breaking new ground, and he's saying you could have something that's totally passive, like the mashal I gave you of a piece of wood that is being thrust by the force of the stream downstream and is endangering whatever it's endangering. There's no maisa redifa. It's just an inanimate object that's being thrust. So that's what I call a rodef b'shevi altas, meaning a passive rodef. And a passive rodef is a rodef, but it's not a rodef. It's in that middle category, as the Rambam calls it, kir rodef. We can't classify it as a rodef because there's no Maisa Redifa. But it is a rodef in a broader definition, which includes even Shevi Al Taseh, in the fact that it is endangering the life of someone else. And that's true both for the Masa and for the Uber. Is anybody following? I don't know if Ari, David, I don't know where. I guess.
Yeah, where?
You there, Ari? I see your name. Okay, there you are.
I'm following.
David, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. I'm following.
Okay. So again, if you're following, I need you to, in a face-to-face share, it's a little different. In Zoom, it's like critical to get your participation because otherwise I'm like talking to a screen. You know what I mean? And all I see is names. So what can you tell me about both the case of the Masa and the case of the Ubar? What's common to both those cases, and why does the Rambam call them kirodef?
Lack of the master.
There's no maser here.
No,
Absence
what kind
of
of
a master
maser?
differ.
No maser redifa. So what's a full-fledged rodef? A full-fledged rodef has a maser redifa. Again, I don't know if it has kavanah, it doesn't have kavanah. I'm not sure about a katan, if the katan is capable of kavanah. And yet the katan is considered a full-fledged maser redifa. And the Rambam does not add the word kirodef or kamorodef with regard to a katan. But in the case of the ubar, the Rambam sees the ubar as endangering the life of the mother without any sort of action on its part. It's just being thrust, like the river that we spoke about. And the masa is just the weight of the masa is endangering the ship, but there's no maisa redifa. And in these cases, the Rambam has carved out a brand new definition called kimo rodef. So why is it that in the case of a maisa redifa, we call it a full-fledged rodef? In the case where there's no maisa redifa, it's only shevi alta, so we say it's kir rodef. I mean, that's all very nice and dandy. But at the end of the day, the Rambam seems to be treating a kirodef as if it was a rodef. I mean, there doesn't seem to be any nafkamina. Why should we make this distinction? I mean, it's a very nice abstract distinction, but as the lawyers would say, how does it cut ice? Where's the nafkamina between a full-fledged rodef and kirodef in the case of shevi altas? So the truth of the matter is, Rabbosai, if the entire enterprise of rodef boils down to the following: kill the rodef to save the nirdav. Hatzolas hanirdav. From that perspective of Hatzolas hanirdav, it really makes no difference whether it's rodef with a maisa redifa or kirodef in a case of Shevi Altas. Because no matter how you slice the cake, it's always Hatzolas HaNirdaf. The element of danger in the life of the Nirdaf is absolutely identical, whether the Rodef is active or passive. So if the Rambam is insisting on two categories, and there are enough geminas between an active Rodef with a Meiser Redifa, Bekuvase, as opposed in contrast to a Kir Rodef without a Meiser Redifa, then the Rambam must be operating with an additional element, an additional dimension, above and beyond Hatzolas HaNirdaf. Is anyone following just the logical development? I haven't said anything yet. I mean, I'm about to say something, but are you following what I'm trying to look for? Where I'm trying to lead you? We seem to tend to identify the parsha of Rodef as in the following terminology: let's save the Nirda. Well, if that be the case, it's all about saving the Nirdaf, then what difference does it make whether the Rodef is active or passive? Even in the case of a passive Rodef, like take, for example, the Rambam in Perek Ches Milchus Chovel with the Masa, we have to save the Nirdaf. The Hatzalah is exactly identical. Yeah.
Isn't there a difference between the case where they're equal, the Rodef and the Nirdaf, like with the baby?
Yeah.
So therefore, who's to determine who the Rodef is?
What do you mean by equal? I don't understand.
Like the mother is as much a Rodef of the baby as the baby is of the mother.
Well, I wouldn't agree with that, though, but I'll tell you why. The mother is not doing anything to the Uber at all. It's the Uber that is, again, actively or passively, that's a distinction, but it's projecting its body through the body of the mother. And that makes it a Rodef. I wouldn't say that the mother is in any sense at all a Rodef achar Ubar. The mother is not endangering the life of the Uber. On the contrary, the mother is trying her best to give birth to the Uber.
Right, but the endangerment of the Ubar after the Ubar has come out is also not the Ubar's fault. I mean, it's not the Uber's not doing anything. And now it's a fully fledged human being.
Correct. Whether the Uber already pops its head out or hasn't yet, it's in the mother's womb. In both cases, the Uber is Kirodef, meaning it's a passive redifa. But what I'm trying to understand here is, what is the significance within the context of the halacha of Rodef, which means that we kill the Rodef to save the Nirdaf, between a passive Rodef and an active Rodef? In both cases, even if the Rodef is passive, and there are forces working on the Rodef from without, it doesn't make a difference because we have to save the life of the Nirda.
Right, but a co-rider has to be alive. If a co-rider is alive, then
who's alive?
it's not mitzvah like a rider is.
I'm sorry, I didn't catch the word before alive. If
a co-rider is a fully fledged human being, then maybe it's different to one that isn't.
That's what I'm trying to define.
Like Rashi.
Wherein lies the difference? If the Rambam is saying that the Ubar b'mei imo kodem sheyotza rosho is a Rodef, Kir Rodef, And that's why we can take the life of the ubar in order to save the mother. So why isn't kirodev enough to justify taking the life of the uber even after it pops its head out? And if you're going to tell me, well, the uber is not a rodev because it's shevi altaseh, then I'm going to ask you two questions. So why do we kill the uber before it pops its head out? After all, it's a nefesh, according to the Rambam Shita. And then I'll ask you another question. If you're going to argue that the ubar cannot be classified and defined as a rodef because it's totally passive, then why does the Rambam say harei hu kirodef? And therefore the Rambam justifies killing the ubar before by virtue of the fact that it's kirodef. The Rambam is obviously compelled to learn that this sugya is a sugya of rodef, not like Rashi, who says that it's a sugya of lav nefeshu. So once the Rambam is on board and he says that the ubar, despite the fact that it's passive, is nevertheless a rodev, like the case of the Masa, and that's how the Rambam justifies that we will kill the uber before it pops its head out, then how does the Rambam justify that once the uber pops its head out, that kirodev situation is not enough to justify taking the life of the uber?
No, so maybe according to Rambam, it has certain rights as a nefesh, more than Rashi. In other words, you can't just kill the uber stam, but when its life is compared to someone else's life, then it's got less of a status.
Okay, but you have to admit, David, that that's very vague. I'm trying.
It's very vague. It's very vague. It's not.
I'm trying to sharpen it. I'm trying to define it.
Right.
So give me. We don't have much time. We got to go Dab Ma'ariv soon, but give me a few minutes to try to develop the following idea. As I said before, Tzvei Din. There's more to the parsha of Rodef than meets the eye. It's not just about saving the life of the Nirdav. If it were, then again, we're back to square one. We don't know why the status of the Uber should change after it pops its head. But rather, there's a whole nother dimension to the Parsha and the law of a Rodef. And that's a Chiyuv Misa. For example, you may recall that the Gemara has a Havamina that we cannot kill the Rodef on Shabbos because we don't execute a condemned criminal on Shabbos. You may recall that the Gemara thought that the only way you could kill the Rodef is with Sayef because that's how we kill a murderer. Do you remember that? If you don't, then let's do a Chazorah. There are many, many dinim in Rodef that could only be explained in the light of the premise that a Rodef is Chayav Misa. So there are really two different factors or two different forces here that overlap in the case of a Rodef that allow us to kill the Rodef to save the Nirdaf. Number one, the din of Hatzola. We've got to save the Nirdaf. And number two, the Chiyuv on the Rodef. And herein, perhaps, lies the distinction between a Rodef Bekum Vaseh and a Rodef B'Shei V'Al Taseh. In a Rodef Bekum Vaseh, which the Rambam says is a full-fledged Rodef without a Chafat Dimyon, Bekum Vaseh, it's active, with a Meiser Adifa. Then we have two dinim. We have one din of saving the Nirdaf and another din of a Chiyuv Misa on the Rodef. Is that clear? But in the case of a passive Rodef, namely a Rodef B'Shei V'Al Taseh, the Rambam says yes. there is a rodef here. And the uber is a rodef. But kirodef, what does that mean? Kirodef, it's lacking a second element of rodef. What's the second element of rodef? In addition to Hatzolas and Nirdaf, what?
Well, we need to save the nirdaf, but we don't have, but they're not chayiv misa.
Excellent. There's no chiyuv misa. Do you follow? We have two elements in rodef, and we can check off both of them, and then we have a full-fledged rodef, or we can check off only one of them, and we have a kirodef. What are those two elements that have to be checked off? One is Hatzolas HaNirdaf, and the other is chiyuv misas harodef. In a classic rodef with a meiser redifa, we have two dinim. We can check off both boxes. We have to save the nirdaf, and we have to put the rodef to death by virtue of its meiser redifa. But in the case of a passive rodef, true, we have halacha of Hatzolas HaNirdaf. The passivity is not relevant to Hatzolas HaNirdaf, but we cannot check off the box of a chiyuv misa, because the chiyuv misa is conditional on a ma'isa redifa, which we don't have. So the Rambam says kirodef. Kirodef means that a passive rodef, b'shevi altaseh, although it generates halach of rodef, but only vis-a-vis one halach of Hatzolas HaNirdaf. But as far as the chiyuv misa is concerned, then a rodef b'shevi altaseh, like the ubar b'mei imo, does not have the chiyuv misa. So far, so good? Okay. Now, what's the nafkamina? Nafkamina is as follows. With regard to a rodef b'shevi altaseh, kir rodef, because we checked off one box out of two, and we classified it as a rodef for what purpose, with what repercussions and implications? The answer is Hatzolas HaNirdaf. What does that mean? What that means is that the halach of ein dochin nefesh b'nei nefesh does not kick in. It's not activated because there are new dinim of Hatzolah. Normally, within the context of Hatzolah, Hatzolah is a great mitzvah, the greatest of all mitzvahs. You'll save the life of someone whose life is in danger, but not at the expense of someone else's life. So within the dinim of Hatzolah, there's a limit and a barrier beyond which we cannot proceed and implement Hatzolah, namely to take another nefesh. But these new dinim of Hatzolah, which are generated by the rodef, allowing us to take the life of the rodef, allow us to judge where we should put the Hatzolah here and whether or not we're allowed to kill the kir rodef to save the life of the nirdaf. And we're going to say the following. Okay, no doubt that we can override the Shabbos for the sake of Hatzolas ha'ubar, the uber is a nefesh. But the Rambam says that if a Jew kills an uber, he's not chayiv misa. We can't put him to death. He's obviously a nefesh, but not completely a nefesh. What do you mean not completely a nefesh? We used to say either she's pregnant or she's not pregnant. There's no middle ground here. But the answer is that in these new dinim of Hatzolah, which are generated by the Shem Rodef, even in the case of Kir Rodef, we make that hierarchy, so to speak, that distinction between the nefesh of the ubar and the nefesh of the mother. And in Hatzolah now, we're allowed to do whatever we have to do to save the mother, even if it means taking the life of the ubar. And why? because the Uber is a Rodef. And as a virtue of the fact that the Uber is a Rodef, we are allowed to change the laws of Hatzolah, because there are new dinim of Hatzolah that are engendered by the Shem Rodef. But the Rambam says that those new dinim of Hatzolah have a limit. They only apply before the baby has popped its head out. Because before the baby pops its head out, we can introduce and activate this new din of Hatzolah, in which we weigh the nefesh of the Uber against the nefesh of the mother. But that new din of Hatzolah can no longer apply once the Uber has taken its head out. The only din that could apply after the Uber pops its head out is the full-fledged din of Rodef, namely the Chiyuv Misa. But the Rambam has the Chaf HaDimyon. And with this Chaf HaDimyon, the Rambam downgrades, so to speak, the status of the Rodef with regard to the Uber. And the Uber doesn't have a full-fledged status of a Rodef. Namely, it doesn't have a Chiyuv Misa. If it doesn't have a Chiyuv Misa, then we cannot, Mimanav shall kill the Uber, not be din Hatzolah, because even in the new din of Hatzolah generated by the Shem Rodef, we cannot differentiate between one nefesh and another. And what are you going to tell me? But the Torah allows me to kill the Rodef for the sake of Hatzolah Sanhedrin. Yeah, that's because of the Chiyuv Misa. But when there's no Chiyuv Misa, we cannot choose one nefesh over the other. So in the case of a Rodef B'Shevi Altaseh, where we don't have a Chiyuv Misa, then what gives you the right to choose one nefesh over the other? You want to save this nefesh? Fine. But don't take another nefesh in order to save one nefesh. Masha Ein came before the Uber pops its head out. That's something different. There it's a Rodef, albeit only as far as Hatzolah Sanhedrin is concerned, but that's all I need, because now we have a new set of rules and regulations that govern Hatzolah. And we're allowed to take a nefesh she'eino gamur in order to be matzil a nefesh gamur. I can't do that once the baby pops its head out and it's a full-fledged nefesh, because it doesn't have a chiyuv misa. All right, we'll stop here. Shkaya Gadol, thank you so much. And
thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
I'm all fashvitz, you know. All right then.
I hope you're drinking.